Define materials. In this video, we'll set up generative design materials. In Fusion 360, we want to carry on with our generative suspension. At this point, we've defined our design space by setting up our preserve and obstacles and even defining a symmetry plane. We've set up our loads and constraints, our objectives, and even our manufacturing methods. So the next step in the process is going to be to set up our study materials. Each manufacturing process that we set up, in this case unrestricted and die casting, is going to produce a single result for each material. So under the materials, we need to make sure that we determine appropriate materials that are used for each of those methods. There are two different ways that we can do this. We can set up materials for all methods, or we can pick specific methods that we want for certain materials. In our case, I'm going to simply use all methods, but if we were looking at machining a certain type of material, or if we included additive, for example, we would only want to use additive materials for that additive process and not for all solves. Making sure that we narrow down the material choices that are applicable is going to be an important step in the process to make sure that we're not using extra computational resources and waiting for additional solves that really aren't going to make sense. But again, we're not going to be solving this in the course, so for our example, we're going to navigate to the Fusion 360 material library, and then we're going to begin by selecting metal, and we're going to start with aluminum. You'll notice that this material has cost estimation as shown by that small calculator. So if we included cost estimation, then this would have the appropriate data to support that. Next, we're going to scroll down and find aluminum 6061. As we scroll through the large list of materials available, you'll notice that 6061 has that calculator icon as well. So I'm going to drag it up into In This Study, and I'm going to continue scrolling through the choices. Next, I'm going to include aluminum 7075. The 7075 does not have cost estimation associated with it, but we can still use it as a material option. So we now have a couple of aluminum options. We need to move on to including some cast iron materials. So we're going to select iron cast as our first option. And then we're going to select iron cast, and we're going to look at some of the other available options that we have. In this case, we're going to use A48 grade 60. And lastly, we're going to include a standard steel material. So we want to take a look at the differences between these materials and how they affect things like whether or not it's adding or removing material in certain areas, and how those properties are going to affect the overall build. So for this, I'm going to simply select a standard 1018 106 hot rolled steel. I'm going to say OK. Keeping in mind that we are using unrestricted method and we're using a cast method. So it will try to solve all the materials for all the study types that we have because we're using all methods. What this is going to tell me is whether or not we're making good design choices with the materials that we're using and the methods that we're manufacturing. We can see how aluminum stacks up against some of these other options. As always, let's make sure that we do save before we move on.